Hey friends, first of all, I just want to say how much I appreciate the FCF family and how much they've meant to Lori and I, your friendship and your encouragement. And you may or may not know this, but recently as an organization, you helped to support a work that we're a part of right now called House of Resurrection, where we're providing an actual residential center for ministers, for men, and for marriages that are in crisis that we're building right here in the Tulsa area. So we really appreciate you guys. Love you. I've got a word for you today, just a word of encouragement. And I know, all of us are in the field doing our work, taking the gospel to people. And sometimes there's just a really good reminder, and this is a reminder that the Lord has passed on to me recently. There's a lot of things we can bring in our messaging, in our communications, both to the people that we're ministering to, but also to our community, to the world that we're reaching. And I was reading through Matthew 17 the other day. And there's this part and passage that is one of the most amazing events in all of Scripture. So Jesus takes his three key leaders, the ones that would go on to lead the early church. He takes James and Peter and John, and they go up this mountain. And they get to the top of the mountain, and we call this now the story of the Mount of Transfiguration. They get to the top of the mountain, and all of a sudden, Jesus is not just there with his three disciples, but standing there, amazingly, are Moses, Elijah, and Jesus. And so the reason this is so incredible is because these men were Jewish. These disciples were Jewish. They were brought up under the rabbi. They were brought up, knowing all of the Old Testament. And hey, Moses and Elijah, to put it in common terms, were like the rock stars of the Old Testament, right? Moses brings down the law. Elijah's like the great prophet of the Old Testament, just powerful, amazing men of God. And so the disciples are just like, oh my goodness, we are in heaven. In fact, Peter said, let's just build a tent and stay here. We don't need to go anywhere else. But then something happens, and suddenly the Father comes on the scene, and we see Moses disappear in the Scripture, just vanish. And then we see Elijah disappear and vanish. And only Jesus is left. And the Father speaks and says, "This is my beloved Son. Listen to him." And so what do we take from that story? I think what we can take is that there was a focus that needed to be present with these leaders of the early church, and it was Jesus. They were so enthralled, as anyone would be, with Moses and with Elijah, with the Old Covenant, the Old Testament, that the Father had to be very clear. From here on forward, these men, these prophets, the law, they've brought us to this place. But from here on forward, this is a Jesus work. This is a Jesus community. This is a Jesus thing. And I'll just share from my own experience, friends. Right now, I see the churches, the ministries that have their centrality of focus on Jesus, preaching Jesus, talking about Jesus, living for Jesus, focused on Jesus, are the ones that I'm seeing bear the most fruit, because I think that's what the gospel is all about. And it's never to discount any other part of Scripture or any other truth that we're bringing to our community and to the people in our congregation. But this focus on Jesus, I believe, is incredibly important. We especially in the Western world, in America, Canada, where many of us live, we are inundated with so many different messages from the church, and there's political messaging, and there's denominational messaging, and there's theology, disputes and messaging. And I think the world at large is looking for a church community that is focused on Jesus. I have a son that is really, he's in his 30s now, late 30s. He's really walking through a lot of questions and doubts about his faith. And he's been walking through this for more than a decade. And I've been as a father and as a believer in Jesus, I've been walking with him. And he once really walked with Jesus, grew up in our church and was in our youth group, even worked for our church for a short season of time. But in over 10 years of him leaving the faith, in those conversations, I've asked him some really, really important questions. And one of the things that I found out in kind of working with, a son who at one point told me he had become an atheist. Now he would refer to himself as a seeker. And I asked him a question. And I said, Bub, do you ever miss any part of the church? When you think back to growing up in the church, is there anything that you really miss? And he looked at me and he said, Dad, I miss Jesus. He said, I still believe Jesus was one of the most radical revolutionaries that the world has ever seen. He said, I'm not sure that I believe he's the Son of God yet. I'm not sure that I believe he was divine, but there was no other man like him who lived his message, who lived for the marginalized, who cared for the poor, who had a message of both truth and love, who stood up to the hypocrisy of the religious elite and was there for those that were in the margins and those without hope. And when I heard that, I thought, there's a lot of people like my son in our world today that have a lot of questions about God and the church, but they know there's something about Jesus. Guess what? Your world is waiting to hear that message. This radical revolutionary never wrote a book, never built a building, only lived 33 years, never traveled more than 100 miles from his own hometown, but 2,000 years later, changed the world. This is the power of this man. This is the power even of that name. Jesus is so, so beautiful, and the world is just waiting for you to share the real Jesus of the Gospels, the real Jesus of Scripture. And so I'm reminded today, and I want to just share that with you, that the Father says to us, this is my beloved Son. Listen to him and then proclaim him. God bless you.